When Novocaine begins, it's incredibly easy to think you've already figured the movie out. A guy who literally can't feel pain. Of course the action scenes are going to be insane. And they are. Watching Nate accidentally weaponize his own disability is hilarious. The movie gets a surprising amount of mileage out of one simple idea, but that's also what makes its biggest strength so easy to miss. Because Nate's condition isn't really the story, it's the lens the story is using to talk about something much more relatable. Purpose. Part 1. The weakness. If you only watch the action scenes, you probably think Nate hit the genetic lottery. He can't feel pain. He survives injuries that would stop anyone else. People shoot him, stab him, break him, and he just keeps going. Sounds like a superpower. Except, look at what his life was before any of that happened. His apartment is practically childproof. Every meal is calculated. Every decision is cautious. He's constantly checking himself for injuries he can't feel. He's not living fearlessly. He's living carefully. His condition hasn't made him powerful. It's made him afraid. And I think that's where the movie quietly tricks us. Because Nate's biggest limitation isn't physical. It's the story he's been telling himself, that his condition determines the size of his life. And honestly, how many of us do that? Maybe not with a rare disorder, but with the things we wish we could change about ourselves. I'm too quiet. I'm awkward. I'm not attractive enough. I'm too old. I'm not talented enough. Over time, those thoughts stop feeling temporary. They become identity. And once something becomes a part of your identity, you stop questioning whether it's actually true. Then Nate meets Sherry, and everything changes. Not because she fixes him, because she gives him something he never had before. A reason. Part 2. Purpose. When Sherry enters the picture, something happens that completely changes the meaning of Nate's condition. Not the condition itself, the meaning behind it. Because before Sherry, Nate's entire life revolved around avoiding pain. Not physical pain, the consequences of it. He avoided risks. He avoided uncertainty. He avoided anything that reminded him he was different. His world had become incredibly safe, but also incredibly small. Then Sherry walks into it, and for the first time, Nate isn't thinking about himself anymore. He's thinking about someone else. That's such a subtle shift that I almost missed it the first time I watched the movie. Because when the bank robbery happens, Nate doesn't suddenly become fearless. He's terrified. He hesitates. He second guesses himself. He makes mistakes. The movie never asks us to believe that love erased his fear. It asked us to notice something much more interesting. Fear stopped being the most important thing in the room. Purpose became bigger than fear. And I think that's something we've all experienced. Whether it's a relationship, a child, a dream, or even a responsibility. Sometimes life hands us something that matters more than our excuses. The fear doesn't disappear. The insecurity doesn't disappear. The weakness doesn't disappear. It just stops getting the final vote. That's exactly what happens to Nate. His disability never changes. But suddenly, the thing that kept him from living becomes the thing that allows him to save someone else. And that's such a beautiful reversal, because it isn't about becoming someone new. It's about finally seeing yourself differently. Part 3. The strength. Here's what I think makes Novocaine work. The action isn't entertaining because Nate can't feel pain. It's entertaining because, for the first time in his life, his condition finally has a purpose. Think about how differently we experience those injuries. If the movie opened with Nate getting stabbed by a random stranger for no reason, it wouldn't be funny. It would just be uncomfortable. But by the time the action really begins, every punch, every broken bone, every ridiculous injury is connected to one simple goal: save Sherry. And that changes everything, because now, the audience isn't laughing at Nate. We're rooting for him. Every time he gets back up, it isn't impressive because he doesn't feel pain. It's impressive because he refuses to stop. That's a huge difference. His disability never makes him courageous. His love does. The condition simply gives him the ability to keep acting on that courage. And I think that's why the action feels so satisfying. Every injury becomes visual proof of how far he's willing to go. The bruises, the broken fingers, the blood, they're no longer signs of weakness. They're evidence of commitment. That's why this movie feels surprisingly emotional beneath all the comedy. Because every ridiculous fight scene is secretly asking the same question. What would you endure for someone you love? Not because you're fearless, not because you're invincible, but because some people become more important than your own comfort. And maybe that's why Nate becomes such an easy character to root for. He's never the strongest guy in the room. He's never the most skilled. He doesn't suddenly become John Wick. He wins because he refuses to quit. Not for himself, for someone else. And I think that's one of the most human ideas an action movie can explore. Part 4. Purpose changes everything. I think that's why Novocaine stuck with me more than I expected. Because somewhere beneath all the broken bones, the exploding arrows, and the absurd fight scenes, it's quietly asking a question I think most of us wrestle with. What if the thing you hate the most about yourself isn't actually the problem? For most of his life, Nate believed his condition was the reason he couldn't really live. It made him cautious. It made him isolated. It convinced him that his life had to be smaller than everyone else's. But here's what's interesting. The movie never cures him. It never takes his condition away. Because that isn't the point. Instead, it changes the way Nate sees it. The same condition, the same body, the same limitations, now means something completely different. Not because they've changed, because he has. And I think that's something we all experience at some point. We spend years trying to fix parts of ourselves we don't like. Maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's being quiet, maybe it's failing, maybe it's growing up feeling like you were always different. We convince ourselves that life can't really begin until those things disappear. But sometimes they don't disappear. Sometimes they become the very thing that shape who we become. Not because they're easy, not because they're enjoyable, but because they force us to grow in ways we never expected. Purpose has a funny way of doing that. It doesn't erase our weakness. It gives them somewhere to go. And maybe that's the real superpower in Novocaine. Not a man who can't feel pain. A man who finally found something worth hurting for. Conclusion. When I started Novocaine, I thought I was watching a movie about a guy who can't feel pain. By the end, I realized I was watching a movie about someone who finally had a reason to endure it. And I think that's why the action works. Not because it's over the top. Because every punch, every fall, every ridiculous injury means something. It's no longer about surviving. It's about choosing someone else's life over your own comfort. Maybe that's why I enjoyed this movie more than I expected. Not because it reinvented the action genre, but because underneath all the chaos, it reminded me of something simple. The things we spend our lives trying to hide aren't always the things holding us back. Sometimes they're just waiting for a purpose.